Hey everybody. Well, thanks a lot for coming to this webinar today. What I want to go over and just kind of recap a little bit of what Amanda just said was that this webinar is going to be really a kind of like a 100 level webinar, an explanation of SharePoint, SharePoint 2010 that is. It's mostly targeted to those of you who are ASP.NET developers. So you don't really have to have any experience with SharePoint for this. I'm going to start pretty basic. If you do have some SharePoint experience, if you have gone through and you've done some stuff with SharePoint 2010, I'll be honest, you're not going to get a whole lot out of me today. That's going to be the stuff we're going to do tomorrow. So what I want to cover, just a couple different points here. First, I'm going to talk about the SharePoint development environment. So like, what are you going to need to do to stand up your own SharePoint development environment? What do you need? What's required, your different options available, and that kind of stuff. Kind of answering some of the more common questions that we get. And then I also want to go through and talk a little bit how the development in your SharePoint experience is different from a traditional ASP.NET experience. And the reason for that is you're going to have, you find, I tell people that the best kind of SharePoint developer, the best person coming into a SharePoint development is going to be someone with a really strong ASP.NET background. But you also quickly find that an ASP.NET person can also get real frustrated really quick when you find out that it's, hey, this isn't just like ASP.NET. So I don't want to say it was just like ASP.NET. I'll just kind of explain some of the things that are different. I'll do a little introduction into SharePoint, just kind of real quick on what's a site, what's a list, libraries, all that kind of stuff. But then I want to go into talking a little bit about some of the development tools and then show you kind of how to go through and do some of the more common stuff. Finally, I'm going to touch on how can you get help going forward. You need to know, where are the forums, where are the best forums to go to, books, great places to get information online. Got a couple links for some like free training and stuff like that as well on here. So with that, let me go ahead and dive in. And like Amanda said, please feel free to go ahead and post questions to the little question panel on the meeting. I'll keep an eye on them and try and answer them as we're going along. I'll see how we're doing on time, see if I'm running a little long, and if so, I may just punt them all to the very end if I'm kind of getting myself too far off track here. We are doing another one of these tomorrow. The webinar we're doing tomorrow is all about kind of data access. So today is kind of getting your feet under you for SharePoint, and then tomorrow is the most common stuff that you're going to want to do, which is reading and writing to SharePoint from the server, from the client. So first thing, let's talk about what's up with this development environment. What do we need? So traditionally in SharePoint, we used to have to go through, we had to install SharePoint on a server-based operating system, specifically 2007. I think this next piece I'm going to do is going to answer this first question that just came in from Salem about, is it possible to build a developer workstation without the need to have SharePoint 2007 set up locally? So let me just kind of run through this, and I think I'll answer it. What Microsoft did with SharePoint 2010 is they've still got it set up to where in a production environment you have to run on Windows Server 2008. It can be Windows Server 2008 R2, but it has to be Windows Server 2008. Another requirement that they have that's different from the previous version is that it's a 64-bit only application. That being said, you don't have any kind of options if you're running a 32-bit system. You may look at it and say, well, yeah, I could probably virtualize stuff using the different virtualization technologies, but you really don't. You're not going to have enough memory that you're going to be able to allocate to the virtual machine, because SharePoint itself really needs, as the whole machine is on, a bare minimum of about 4 gigs. It's everything in SharePoint 2010. It's based off of off the .NET Framework 3.5 SP1. So it does not support the .NET Framework version 4. That's not available yet. They haven't said if they're going to, or when, or even if. So it's kind of up in the air to see where that goes. So with that, we have to kind of wait and see what Microsoft gives us. The nice thing though is that because of how .NET 4 and .NET 3.5 can run side by side, you can have a .NET 4 application on the same box. You just can't run the SharePoint web applications or the websites. They have to run under .NET 3.5. Okay. I saw somebody ask a question here. They're only seeing, are you asking if you should be seeing slides or just seeing a desktop? And you're just seeing the desktop. I don't have a whole bunch of slides. I'm going to spend, right now, I just got a little bit of talking to do, and I'll come back and start showing you some stuff in just a few minutes. Excuse me. SharePoint is also going to require SQL, Microsoft SQL Server. You can use SQL 2008. You can use R2 if you like. All of that. Now, when you go through and when you install SharePoint, you have really two options. You're going to go through and you can install it on a server-based operating system, which is how you're going to want to go through and do this in production or in your shared environments, right? One of the other options that Microsoft gave us in 2010 is they actually made it so SharePoint can now be installed to Windows 7 or to a Vista machine that's running Service Pack 2 or later. The only requirement there is that it absolutely must be 64-bit operating system. You can't go through and do 32-bit. So you can install SharePoint locally on your client machine. There are actually some scripts, and I can go through and pull them up at the end if somebody is curious, but there's some scripts that somebody named Chris Johnson at Microsoft put up on the SharePoint team blog or developer blog that shows how you can go through and run a little PowerShell script, and it does everything you need to go through and install SharePoint, configure, and all that kind of stuff. You could do it, boot to VHD, all those different options. Me personally, I like to use Hyper-V, and I do everything virtualized, just because I just find that doing SharePoint development there with so many configuration things just easier. But it's totally up to you. The only word of caution I would give you is that when you install SharePoint on a client operating system, just remember you're installing a server product on top of a client operating system. There are things that just flat out will not work, and there are things that will work, but they'll go a little kind of quirky and wonky on you, and you'll have a hard time kind of figuring out what's wrong and all that stuff. Microsoft likes to give the option, but I'm personally not the biggest fan of it there. Okay, so the big thing is that you'll have some stuff that just flat out doesn't work that well on the client operating system. Like for instance, the Excel services, all the business intelligence stuff, none of that stuff is going to work well on on a client operating system. And plus, you can't really test a true farm implementation with a bunch of Windows 7 laptops, right? So the other thing too, to do your development is you're going to need Visual Studio 2010. Now, Visual Studio 2010, one of the things that Microsoft did, and those of you who have done SharePoint development before or have at least heard all the terrible stories from the 2007 days, you would have probably seen that a lot of people were giving some very colorful descriptions and adjectives of the development story with SharePoint 2007, and that's because they were all pretty much correct. It pretty much was a pretty bad experience. This time around, Microsoft put a lot of money behind it, a lot of resources, I should say, and the Visual Studio team built some first-class dev tools included in Visual Studio 2010. So when you install Visual Studio, the same place where if you did a custom install and you say, I want to do VB or C# or C++, those graphics libraries, the Dotfuscator tool, in that same list at the very bottom, you have an option for SharePoint development tools. Okay. Now, this is answering someone's question earlier. The one thing that is that's going to be a bit of a challenge here is that the development tools that Microsoft is giving us for SharePoint, they only work against a local install of SharePoint. There's no remote debugging support that's in there. It can't go through and deploy to a remote server or any of that kind of stuff. It's only going to work against a local install of SharePoint. And this is going to go into some of the, kind of go into a little bit of how is SharePoint 2010 development different from ASP.NET. The reason for this is that in order for Microsoft to build these dev tools, they had to go through and add a lot of hooks into the API, in the SharePoint API for Visual Studio. Okay, they had to go through and add a lot of hooks into the SharePoint API. When they did that, that meant that they had to go through and lock it down so that you couldn't have like some spoofing or some hacking going on. So you can only do these hooks only respond to things that are coming from the same machine. Now, with that being said, you can go through and create a project that's based off of one of the SharePoint project templates. You can go through and do some work with it and everything, but you can even try and build it, but nothing is going to really build correctly. Even if you bring your assemblies over, I mean, that's from the SharePoint assemblies and put them in your project locally and reference those. You're just not going to get a very good experience there. Okay, so you really need to have a SharePoint and Visual Studio installed on the same machine, whether that's a client operating system or server. We've already covered that. It's really up to you. Okay. Now, I say that SharePoint development is the people that are coming into SharePoint development. Those with a very strong ASP.NET background are really at the biggest advantage. And the reason why I say that is because SharePoint is just a product that's been built on top of ASP.NET. It is a web application. It's got a lot of stuff that they've built for us that we don't have to deal with. A lot of things that we're used to having to build in our own applications, and a whole web UI that is really, really friendly and makes it easy for our power users and our business users to go through and interact with it. There are some things that are different. Like, for example, you have to understand that as an ASP.NET developer, I'm traditionally building the entire system, right? Or my team is. I'm building the entire website and the entire web application. In SharePoint, I don't like to call ourselves SharePoint developers as application developers. To me, it makes a lot more sense to call us we're more component or integration developers, because we're going to build lots of little things and we're going to put them into this system called SharePoint, and we're going to hook it up and install it and then make it all work. So you have to get in this frame of mind that I'm building lots of little things. So think about it like if you were an ASP.NET developer, but you never built an ASPX page, or you never built a web service or WCF service. The only things you built were server controls, user controls, or things like web parts. All right. If you think about it like that, that's basically what it's like being in SharePoint, because we really rarely build ASPX pages. We just use the ones that we already have, and then we orchestrate our stuff on the page to make it all work together and work well. Okay. So you have to kind of just get that kind of frame in mind. That's also, I just mentioned a second ago, it's also how you can see how there's a bit of a difference with the developer environment, where the barrier to entry is a little bit higher with SharePoint because you have to have SharePoint installed, whereas with ASP.NET, you just need to have, you really don't even have to have a web server because you've got that Cassini thing that comes with Visual Studio. Okay? So, what you see here on the screen here, let me go ahead and jump into this. And I think I saw another question here came in. What are the advantages to having SharePoint development machine on Windows 2008 versus Windows 7? Windows 2008, you're just going to get everything that SharePoint has to offer. It's all going to work just fine inside of Windows 2008. Windows 7, some stuff may not work right. I say this, and it's almost like a joke, but I had this post on my blog a couple of months ago. People kept asking about, why am I not a fan of the Windows 7 experience for doing SharePoint development? Think about it this way. This is the way I look at it. When back in SharePoint 2007, somebody would go to Microsoft and say, look, I want to do SharePoint development, but I can't because my company won't let me install a server operating system on my workstation in my cube. So Microsoft says, all right, fine, we'll install some virtualization software that will let you install a server operating system and then SharePoint in that. The customer comes back and says, well, I can't do that. They won't let me go through and stand up VMs. So Microsoft comes back and says, well, your third option, instead of either installing it right on the base operating system or installing it in a VM, is to go get your IT group and get them to stand up a VM for you. And if you come back and say, well, they still won't let me do that, they won't stand up VMs for me, then your fourth option Microsoft will always have is to quit your job and go somewhere else where they will let you do one of those other three options we gave you. This new Windows 7 option or Vista option, in my mind, is just giving us another option before they say quit your job and go somewhere else. So just take that for what it's worth. The installation, I will tell you, the installation of SharePoint is it is pretty involved. There's a lot of stuff that you have to go through and install. But the nice thing is it's probably the easiest thing you'll ever have to install, aside from, like, say, WinZip or something. What it is that when you go to install it, Microsoft is going to ask you, or SharePoint asks you, it first goes through and it checks to see is everything on the machine that I need in order to run. Like, there's stuff for a speech SDK, there's stuff for the Windows Identity Framework, The neat thing is it takes care of all of that stuff. It does all of that. If you don't have what it needs to run, it automatically downloads everything it needs, installs them, and then goes through with the installation. There's no custom install of SharePoint. You install it, and then you turn things on and off on each install. So every SharePoint server's got the same bits installed. Okay. So let's go over here to my desktop that you see here. This is a Windows Server 2008 machine. I've got Windows Server 2008 R2, Active Directories installed. Let's see what else. SQL servers installed, and then just a couple, and then Visual Studio is also installed. So I'm going to come over here, launch the browser, and what you see is this is just your standard SharePoint site. Okay. So this site here, this is we call this a team site, and what this is where most people are going to go to collaborate. So I've got this kind of a wiki kind of a page here where my users will make it have a lot easier time making changes to it, adding new content to the page and stuff like that. Really easy. Just go in, click the page in edit mode. I click this little edit button. You see here I get the familiar ribbon-based interface that we have in SharePoint 2000 in the Office clients. I can just make some inline changes here. Hello, Mom. Stuff like that. Save my changes. So nothing real fancy there, right? SharePoint sites can have these things called lists and libraries. A list is just a tabular kind of think about it like a table with just the CRUD pages have already been created for us. So I can go through and very easily add new items here, like a task, like pick up milk, save my changes, picks up the milk, we're good. I can also go through and do things with, like, say, document libraries by, like, say, coming over here to the shared documents, and I can upload documents to this place. So a library is the same thing as a list. It just stores documents. A list stores more tabular data. Okay. These different sites can have as many lists and libraries as you want to have in them, and then they can also have child sites. So I can break up, like, say, my department that's in charge of, say, all of our internal projects. I could have subsites for each one of my different each one of my different products and stuff. Okay. All right. So now let's go through and let me kind of show you a little bit of the stuff about show you some of the development stuff. Now that we're 20-some odd minutes into this. So what I've got here, you see I've got my site here, and you can see that my site is listed here at intranet.wingtip.com. And then I'm inside of this library called Site Pages, and then I'm on the page called home.aspx. If I look at the entire structure of my site here, just real quick, and say View All Site Content, what you see is here's a bunch of libraries and lists on my SharePoint site. When I go into the Site Pages library, you can see I have a couple pages. The home page right here that I'm in, this is this ASPX page that we're looking at right here. Okay. Excuse me. So the URL scheme here, it looks a lot like, I hesitate to say this because I don't want people to think you can do this in SharePoint, but it looks a little bit like MVC-ish kind of, but you can't do MVC inside of SharePoint because SharePoint has its own like URL processing engine and stuff like that that was there way before MVC kind of came out. So it'd be a big deal for Microsoft to retrofit that. So if I come over here to Visual Studio, let's go through and let's build something. I've got Visual Studio open right now, and let me go through and let's go through and create a new project. So your most quintessential thing that you could create in SharePoint would probably be a web part. That's the most common thing that people want to create. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say let's create a brand new project. And when I do that, I'm going to go to the SharePoint tab over here on the templates. I'm going to see a list of different things that are available to me. Now, you see the SharePoint 2007 folder right here. You could ignore that for SharePoint 2010. We got 2 workflow templates that are available to us when Visual Studio 2008 released. These are just being carried forward from that former Visual Studio release. I'm going to come over here to Visual Studio 2010, and I'm going to want to sort these in ascending order. I'm going to go through and create a brand new project. So what I generally like doing here is I like going through and saying I'm going to create an empty SharePoint project. So I'm going to click on empty SharePoint project, and then I'm going to go through and stick him into C Dev, and we'll just call him SharePoint Project 1. Now, one thing I need to make sure I pay attention to here is that I need to make sure that where it says .NET Framework 4, I need to switch that over to 3.5 because Visual Studio is by default is going to try and push you to .NET 4. The way that the project templates work, they can't change the version of Visual Studio for you. And because SharePoint doesn't support .NET 4, we got to make sure we build for .NET 3.5. The good thing is that it will go through and set it up to where you're building against either any CPU or 64-bit platform. All right, so I'll just go through and create this guy, empty project. And now the first thing it's going to ask me is, what do you want to use to debug this guy? So I'm going to come over here and say, what site do I want to use? I'm going to go pick the URL of my intranet.wingtip.com site that I'm in, and I'm just going to paste them in right here. Now what that does is that's going to give me the ability to hit F5, and Visual Studio is going to know how to build my project, where to deploy it, what it's going to use that URL to figure out which web application he should attach the debugger to, so I can just do standard breakpoints and everything. Later if we have time. I'm going to just stick with farm solution right now, though. Or on my team doesn't have the same site set up and all that kind of jazz, so we don't have to worry about it. Now, the standard project structure you see here, there's some stuff that's a little bit different or foreign to you when you're doing stuff with ASP.NET. You see a features node and a package node. So SharePoint has what, I guess, being a SharePoint person, I think it's an advantage over ASP.NET. Those of the SharePoint naysayers will probably say this is a disadvantage. But when you look at this, what it is, features, this is think of it as kind of like our SharePoint's own plugin framework. If you've ever played with .NET Nuke, you know how they have modules. This is kind of like that same kind of metaphor. We're going to use features for a ton of different things. We're going to use it to maybe add new functionality to a site, to deploy some stuff to a site, to create some new content inside of a site, lots of different things. The neat thing about features excuse me, is that once I deploy it to the server, I can apply a feature to any site on that server. So anybody can actually use it. So we're going to build a web part. I'm going to deploy it to this one site, but I could go to another SharePoint site and say, well, go add the same web part to this site by just clicking a button. So it's kind of your own little plugin framework. There's a whole scoping metaphor too where you can say, I want to apply this to just one site or all these sites inside of a certain collection. I can apply it to every single site within a web application, or we call them web applications in SharePoint. As ASP.NET developers, you probably look at them and say, hey, in IIS, that's called a website. Well, Microsoft the SharePoint team just likes to give their own name to certain things, so they call it a web application. Or I can deploy something in the entire farm. I can add a page to every single page of my SharePoint site with just 1 or 2 lines of code. Really easy. All right. The package thing that we have here, this is something really cool. This is how we're going to package up any files that we need to deploy to our server. We're going to package them up into this thing called a Windows SharePoint Services solution package, or we just call them packages for short. What that's going to do is we're going to be able to take that file that it generates. It's called a WSP file, but it really is just one of those .cab files that contains all the files that are going to go on the server, and then an XML file called a manifest that's going to tell SharePoint what's in that package and where it's supposed to go. The neat thing about this is that if you had, like, let's say an ASP.NET, excuse me, if you had an ASP.NET, say 5 servers all networked together and load balanced, if you wanted to go through and you wanted to update a website that was all load balanced, How would you do that? You'd either have to have some big server-based product that knows how to go through and to update all the servers at a specific time. I know like some of those mom packs do that kind of stuff for you. Or you'd have to do it all manually. In SharePoint, it does everything for us. I take the package, I add it to one of the servers and say, go deploy this, and it figures out where's this site on what servers in this SharePoint farm. I'll go through and put these files on all those different sites. It doesn't apply the changes yet because I have to go through and do this thing called activating the feature, and that's kind of like, you know, turning on the plugin kind of thing. So it's going to build. The nice thing is that the new dev tools we have dramatically simplifies not only creating features, but packages are really simple and just almost stupid easy to create because you really don't do anything. The tool does it all for you. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say I want to add a new item to my project. So I'll go through and say add new item and sort of ascending. I'm going to pick from all these different SharePoint things I can create here, I'm going to pick a web part. Now you see some of the stuff here where you see like in parentheses sandboxed and CKS dev. The CKS dev stuff, that's an extension to Visual Studio, a free extension to Visual Studio that you can go get from the Visual Studio gallery that they have with SharePoint 2010. Where is that? Extension Manager. So I need to go through and update mine, but you have these two new dev tools that are development tool sets that are available to you. That adds a lot of additional functionality. So a lot of different project templates and all that kind of stuff. So definitely recommend going and grabbing those. So I'm going to say let's add a new item, and I'm just going to pick a web part. All right, and we'll just leave it called web part 1. You'd probably change it. Now what that does, that creates this thing called a new SharePoint project item, or an SPI. And what that did is that added any necessary references to my project that needed to be added, like reference to any kind of like a system.web or anything like that. Close this up a little bit. Let's get rid of the properties tab. It then also went through and added the code file that I have selected there for my web part that's going to contain the actual web part class. And once you build a web part, you then have to advertise it. You have to make sure people know that it's available. And the way we do that is by creating a web part definition. This is just an XML file that tells the ASP.NET web part framework, because see, SharePoint doesn't do anything with web parts. SharePoint leverages 100% the ASP.NET web part framework. The SharePoint team is not in the web part business at all. Everyone thinks that SharePoint is like, I want to build a SharePoint web part. You're really not. You're not building SharePoint web parts. You're building ASP.NET web parts. You're just packaging them up for SharePoint. So all the code will be the same. This right here is just going to tell the ASP.NET web part framework where to go find the web part class in assembly. So I'm going to come over here and we'll just create our quintessential simplest web part, just with your standard. Create a label. And then we'll just set in that label, we'll just set his text property equal to the date, time, now.toString. And then add him to controls add LBL. Add him to the controls collection, okay? So we're good to go there, all right? Now, I'm building a web part the traditional way using a server control. I'm going to show you in a second. We have another way of doing it, building web parts visually. So we have two options. I'm going to come over here then, and I'm just going to hit, we'll just go through and set a breakpoint right here just for kicks, and I'll hit F5, and what you'll see is down in the lower left corner, I've got a lot of stuff going on. It's going to build my project. It's going to package everything up inside of one of those WSP files. Because I told it what site we're going to test against, it knows typical ASP.NET stuff. I've never tested against this site, so I'll just say OK. So modify the web config to do debugging. It's going to go through and take that file. It's going to send the file to SharePoint. It's going to add the solution to this thing called the solution store where all the custom code packages are going to be added to. It's then going to deploy the solution, which is going to push it out to all the servers in the farm. Just happens to be only this one, but I still have to deploy it. And it's going to install the feature, which is going to make all the sites aware of the fact that there's a site, that there's a new feature out there. Now, the first time I'm doing this, it's going a little slow, but it's going to launch the browser in a second, and it's going to take me to the home page of the site that I just went to. So I'm going to come in here. Let's see. We'll just wait for this to go through. It's going to take a second for this guy to go through and take for him to go through and warm up, because the deployment made a change to the web config, and so the app pool recycled. So it's just taking a second for it to spin up again. Let's see. Hint. Show the output screen during deployment to see what's really happening. Okay, I'll do that next time. We're going to build another web part in just a second. Wow, come on now. This is taking way too long. There we go. Okay, so it takes us to our site. Now, I need to go through and get the web part on the page. So the way I'm going to do that is come over here and we'll put the page back in edit mode. So I'll just say let's edit the page. And I want to insert the page. I'm going to insert, go to the insert tab. So I'll put my cursor somewhere on the top of the page here. And I'll say let's insert a web part. And I'm going to pick custom because that's where all my stuff goes by default. So I'll say web part 1. I'll pick add. It'll add my web part to the page. You can see I'm hitting my breakpoint right there, which is kind of cool. So couldn't do that before. Hit F10. Go to the next step. Hit F5. Go right through it, and we should see our web part spitting out the time. All right. I go through and just close the browser here. What that'll do is you can see some stuff going on down here in the bottom left corner. That's going to remove everything I just deployed to SharePoint. So the next time I go test something, everything is nice and clean again. All right. You can turn that off if you don't want it to remove stuff. There's a build option in the properties for your project. If you come over here to the SharePoint tab and scroll to the very bottom, you see this auto retract after debugging. You can turn that off if you want to turn that off. I generally leave it on. There was I remember the product team back in the betas, they were going back and forth, and it was like 50-50 with everybody they asked if they want it checked by default or unchecked. So I voted for checked, and I'll just say that my team won, but I don't think we really posed that great of an argument. We just kind of said we wanted that. All right? So that's just your standard web part. Now, the other kind of web part you'd want to build is, you look at this and say, oh, server-based stuff, that's kind of a pain here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and say, I don't want to build like a server control. I'd like to do it visually. So the other kind of project that Microsoft gave us here is a visual web part. Now, this sounds really impressive, except when you look at it. If we look at what it gives us, go through and clean this up a little bit here. What it gives us is that standard code file for our web part that you see I have highlighted here. It gives us our web part definition, and then it gives us a user control. Well, our web part, this code file here, all he's doing is loading in the user control right here, loading in the user control right inside of create child controls and the aggregate controls collection. So they're just kind of doing a little workaround here. But the nice thing about the workaround is that I do get a nice design surface here where I can go through and I can build my web part visually. So I come over here to the toolbox, and I could do something like, say, I don't know why it's taking so long there. It shouldn't be taking that long. Let's go over here, we'll just add a button. I could take the button, double click him, get my button click, and I could just say button1.text equals to stop touching me. Okay? So this time, let's go through and let's view the output window. I'll show you guys what's going on here when I build them. So this time, we'll go through and hit F5 again, and you'll see what's going through here as it's building the project. It's going to go really fast, but it's going through and doing a bunch of different commands here to clean up the system and everything. As you see, the next part I'm building it, The second time I build it, things are going a lot faster because just things are more warmed up. That was the first project that I had created on this VM. Start clean. I should have done it before we start our webcast. Let's see, come over here to page. I can say add a web part, and again, we'll see our visual web part that we just created. Insert, web part, custom, visual web part, and say add. And ta-da, there's my button. Come out of edit mode. I click my button, should post back, and it should change the text to stop touching me. Okay? So you can see a couple different things there, right? Let's see. So one person asked when I go through and I think you were mentioning if I close the browser from this, is that going to go through and it retracts the web part and everything? Is that going to go through and is it going to pull my web part off the page as well? And the answer is no. It doesn't. What it does, it doesn't go through and remove it, because see what happens is, and this is not a SharePoint thing. This is ASP.NET. But if I come back to the home page of my site that it was just on, I had two web parts here a second ago. You don't see them right now because I didn't refresh this page. This is a different browser window. But you can see here like this void of where the web parts were. What the retraction did is it pulled all the web part and all the pieces of the web part off the server. So the DLL that contained the web part object is no longer on the server. So it's not going to run. What's still there, though, is that when you went back and you when I went back and I added the web part to the page by going this whole edit page thing and said pick the web part and put it on the page, what the web part framework does, and remember this is ASP.NET, this isn't SharePoint, it adds a little block of XML to a web part zone, and it says this block of XML is telling the web part framework that the next, when it runs, go over here to go find the DLL, go in that DLL, create a new instance of this object, and then here's all the properties I want you to put on the public properties of that object. Now go add into the controls collection for rendering. These special wiki pages here, they will look to see if there's any errors that show up from web parts that say the web parts aren't found, and it will actually go through and silence those errors that you get for a better user experience. If I deployed this again and I put it on a typical SharePoint page, like if I go to, like, say, default.aspx, where those of you who did SharePoint 2007 will remember this kind of look and feel, this kind of page would throw a little error where the web part was and says, I can't find the web part. Okay? So the reason why you saw it the second time we ran it, the reason why you saw both web parts show up right here the second time we ran it is because the XML for the first web part is right here. The XML for the second web part is up here. When I reran the project, it just put the DLL back on the site, on the server, and the web part framework was able to find both references. All right, so I hope that answers your question there, John. Let's see, I got two more questions I'll do real quick, and then I want to show you some, like, kind of where to get some help and stuff. Remember, this is just kind of a quick little intro here. Let's see, somebody says, does a web part have to be a postback? Can it take advantage of AJAX stuff? You better believe it can. Oh, so I guess that's two questions. Does it have to be postback? No, it does not. You definitely can go through and participate in AJAX stuff. The nice thing is that everything you need is already on the server. In fact, when I go through in my visual web part, if I look at that in the designer, and I go to the toolbox, I can do things like, where's it? AJAX extensions. I can go through and I can throw like an update panel on the page, and it'll work just fine. We don't need to put anything else on the server. SharePoint has everything it needs for doing anything with the AJAX stuff. You can use jQuery. All that stuff works just fine. They don't ship the jQuery library. You can add that yourself. Or reference one of the more ones on a content deployment networks that like Google and Microsoft provide. And same thing with Silverlight as well. You don't need anything else to do Silverlight development. Tomorrow I'm going to show you some stuff about kind of how some extra stuff that you did, with some extra stuff that I did to go through and use SharePoint, to use Silverlight inside of SharePoint. So another thing, does SharePoint support Silverlight web parts? And if so, what would be a good place to start? A good place to start would be coming to the webinar I'm doing with DevExpress tomorrow. It's the exact same time. I'm actually going to build a Silverlight application and deploy it to SharePoint. SharePoint already has everything it needs to do Silverlight, because if I went through and say edit the page, I can do the quick and dirty version, which is just say insert a brand new web part, and one of the web parts they give me is a Silverlight web part. If I add that to the page, it just says, what's the URL of the Zap? So tomorrow I'm going to build a Zap that pulls data back from a SharePoint RESTful service. All right. So you definitely can do that. Another one too. The other question somebody has here is that what do I need to use What do I need to do to use the DevExpress controls within SharePoint? Answer to that is really nothing special. It's anything that you would have to do with ASP.NET. You're going to have to do that with SharePoint for the DevExpress stuff. So tomorrow I'm going to use the DevExpress grid, Silverlight grid, and deploy him. The same thing is true if I was going to do like a web part that was going to use ASP.NET. I would have to go through and deploy everything I would need to deploy for traditional ASP.NET set to get the DevExpress grid to work. I need to do the exact same thing. It's nothing special for SharePoint. Okay, really nothing all that special. The DevExpress guys do have a SharePoint site. I don't know the URL offhand. I think it's sharepoint.devexpress.com. But they go through and they even give you some kind of a head start on it. Okay. So let me go through and let me just show you one or two other things, and I'll come back and answer some more questions here since we got about 8 minutes or so left. I want to show you some places where you can go to get some help. Now, for standing up, creating your first Visual Studio or your first development machine, if I come over here, what our company did, I have a company called Critical Path Training. What we have here is this setup guide here for building a SharePoint 2010 virtual machine. And what we go through, we basically do, we walk you through every painstaking detail here of how to go through and install and set up a SharePoint VM. There's a lot of pages to this, but trust me, it's not that bad. The biggest thing you have to do is you have to wait for SQL to install, and you have to go download all the stuff that you need, like trial versions of SharePoint and Visual Studio and all that stuff. This document is available on our website. The link to that I'll give it to you in a second, but you just go to criticalpathtraining.com. There's a members section, and if you go there, you just look for the virtual machine setup guide, and we walk you through everything. You don't need anything except for a machine that runs Hyper-V, and you're good to go. What if you run VMware or VirtualBox? It works just the same. You just got to go through and modify the steps a little bit for whatever those products are. Okay, so we make it really easy for you to get started. There's a couple other things too. I'll show you other places to go. For SharePoint 2007, I did this, and a lot of this is true too for SharePoint 2010. This link will come up. If you go to my blog, which is andrewconnell.com/blog, and if you scroll down, doesn't want to scroll down that nicely. Let's see if this will work better. No. Okay, so there is a link. If you go to the MSDN, I don't know why it's doing that. There is a link. Let me just go through and pull the link up real quick. I'll pull it up in a different machine real quick, and I'll give it to you. So hold on a half second here. There's an MSDN article I did that points you to where you can go through and get additional help, like where's the best places to get help and stuff. Wow, nothing wants to scroll. Is scroll lock on? Nope. Wow. I can make that available if you just ping me via email. I can show you where that is. For where you can go through and get like some information about where you can get help and stuff. Other stuff though, good places to go to get help. If you go straight to MSDN, and if you scroll down to the bottom, let's see here, under the core destinations, look for SharePoint Development Center. And right up here at the top for forums, that's going to be one of the best places to go through and ask questions. So MSDN's got a bunch of forums around SharePoint. I'm a little more partial to the Stack Overflow model. There's actually a site called SharePoint Overflow that runs off the same Stack Overflow model. I just prefer seeing one big bucket and questions tagged because you don't really know if things kind of cross between different things. Very popular site, gets a lot of hits, a lot of traffic. If you got to ask questions, it's a great place to go as well. So SharePoint Overflow. if you're looking for training or for like classes, we did a class for Channel 9. It's a SharePoint 2010 developer training course. Just go to Channel 9, and then if you click on the Learn link and go to Courses, under here, if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see a SharePoint 2010 training course. And my business partner and I went through and did a bunch of all these different recordings and everything to show you how to do different things. So a lot of kind of getting up to speed and everything like that. So good free training. And then if you're looking for like a classroom experience, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my company, which does SharePoint training for hands-on classes and stuff like that. Our website's just criticalpathtraining.com, and I'll just pull up this last slide here for some contact info. There you go. So a little bit of contact information here at the very end for where you can go find out some more information about the classes that we offer, developer classes. Hint, hint, I'll be in Redmond next week on the Microsoft campus teaching. Still seats available. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and then I'm also on Twitter and Facebook myself. You can go up there and find me on my contact information up there. Okay? So with that, I guess we can go through and answer some more questions. I don't know if the DevExpress guys wanted to jump in and say anything before I did some more questions.
I don't know if they do or not. I guess they'll jump in, Andrew, if they when they feel like it. I would go ahead and if you want to look through and see what you didn't get to.
Sure. Let's see here. So, what do I need? We did that one. Let's see. What is the best approach to learn PowerShell for SharePoint development? Oh boy. So what Microsoft did is, like they did with Exchange and SQL Server, they added a bunch of PowerShell. They added a PowerShell provider to go through and extend PowerShell so that you have things like commandlets and all that kind of stuff to be able to get to do stuff within SharePoint. There's a primer to using it on that Channel 9 training site that I just gave you a second ago. One of the getting started ones, or I think there's one, a development primer. If you look in there, there's some stuff we kind of get you going from there. So it's not that hard to get up to speed. If you understand PowerShell, learning the SharePoint PowerShell bit is really not that hard. I just find that a lot of people that have been doing SharePoint, we've been kind of ignoring the whole PowerShell thing, and now all of a sudden we have to know it. So it's taking some time to get in there. Another person's got a question. Is it easy to upgrade from SharePoint 2007 or WSS3 to SharePoint 2010? And the answer, with, I guess, as an instructor, I have to always respond with it depends. Depends on what you've done. If everything was really simple and just straight stuff that you did with straight stuff that you did through the browser, then you can do what's called a content database attach. So you just take the content database from SQL and then add it to a site in SharePoint 2010, attach that database to a SharePoint 2010 web app, and SharePoint automatically upgrades it, and you're good to go. However, if you've done a bunch of custom development, if you did a bunch of other customizations and stuff, it just depends. There's other ways of going through and doing migrations and stuff. It's really beyond what I can answer in a minute or so. No offense, Amit, but there's no way I can do a question about how to set up Kerberos authentication for SharePoint 2010 in about a minute. So I would look to TechNet. Let's see. Steven asks, is there any connectivity between parts? Click one web part and another one refreshes. Yeah, you can definitely do that. ASP.NET gives you the ability to have connectable web parts. It's very easy to set it up. The two you can go through and just connect it. One's a provider, one's a consumer, and you just can send data back and forth. It's very straightforward. Okay. And I guess, let's see, let me do one more question here. Can I use VM to host Windows Server 2008 SharePoint with my host being Windows XP, where VMware being installed? Yeah, you can do that. I mean, VMware, you can use stuff. You can install SharePoint on a machine inside of VMware. It works fine. Okay. So I see the clock ticking down. I don't want to go too much farther because I don't know if it shuts off automatically on me, but I just want to thank everybody.
It does.